Sorry about that, babe.
Dragon Warrior 2, aka Dragon Quest II, aka Dragon Warrior / Quest II Luminaries of the Legendary Line, is a turn-based single-player RPG that I had previously beaten before way back in the COVID era on Twitch. So why are we just getting to the review now? Well, I forgot to record my footage appropriately, and I ended up never writing my thoughts down, so it was time for a replay. If you want to watch that, check out the pinned comment or description below. Anyway, since I'm covering the retail release in North America, I will be referring to this title as Dragon Warrior 2. Developed by Chunsoft and published by Enix, Dragon Warrior 2 is released in North America on October 30th of 1990, as a follow-up to the very popular Dragon Warrior. The story. Dragon Warrior 2 takes place 100 years after the events of the first entry. The evil wizard Hargon starts wreaking havoc on the lands and attempts to summon the legendary demon Malroth to put an end to it all. After an attack at Moonbrook Castle, a wounded soldier makes their way to Middenhall Castle, where the king is informed before said soldier passes away. It is now up to you, the son of the king, the descendant of Erdrick, to defeat Hargon. But, unlike the first entry, you won't be going alone. Your cousins, the Prince of Canik and Princess Moonbrook, await your arrival for the epic team-up. The story, as expected, is fairly straightforward, but well executed, including even some callback points to Dragon Warrior, which helps add a little nostalgic spice to the trip ahead. Graphics. I think to the naked eye it's fairly easy to see that the graphics are improved over the first entry, even if it's just subtle. A bit more detail here and there, a few more eye-catching colors on some enemies, and all in all a fairly well-presented graphical game. The bright spot for said graphics, as you could expect, are the variety of enemy sprite designs. However, it is worth noting that the outside random encounter battles no longer have that vibrant overworld and background drop look to them. Rather, every single encounter in the game takes the Dragon Warrior 1 dungeon encounter approach of just a black background, dialogue boxes, and the enemy sprites. The character sprites are all unique and delineated, giving them their own feel as opposed to a general NPC look. Music and sound. Returning to the fold is composer Koichi Sugiyama, who actually worked on almost the entire Dragon Quest series. I just realized while writing this, he did pass away a few years ago. And what is delivered here with Dragon Warrior 2 is a fairly solid sound array. The sound effects themselves are pretty standard as far as attacking, using magic spells, missing an attack, critting, going upstairs, and so forth, but they get the job done effectively. But right off the bat, you'll notice that the Dragon Warrior 2 soundtrack has a bit more depth to it. The first installment, while legendary and catchy, don't get me wrong, I do love it, and in many ways I prefer it, it doesn't quite pack the same depth, oomph, or punch that this one does. This OST is kind of the best of both worlds. You have improved versions of the opening title theme, as well as the overworld theme in a familiar area. Along with that, you have very good changing overworld themes depending obviously where you are, as I just mentioned, but also dependent upon who is in your party or dead at the time. Groovier dungeon themes, RPG troped relaxing seafaring music, but kinda sadly, the best track in the entire game, it's the one that you hear in the final credits. It's a beautiful, whimsical track that I would put up there with the best of the best on the NES. Again, you only hear it at the end, so it's kind of a bummer. But all in all though, solid effort and memorable in many ways. Controls. This section will be short and sweet, since this is obviously not an action RPG. The controls are fairly standard while navigating the overworld towns and dungeons. Menuing is fairly easy, albeit at times somewhat clunky, especially with inventory management across your characters. A nice improvement though to this one is just being able to walk up and down the stairs instead of having to select a menu option to do so. And really the only critique that I have is at times the controls do feel a bit sluggish. Nothing crazy, but it's noticeable here and there. Gameplay and fun factor. I wanted to quickly shout out the localization. I felt like on the whole the game was pretty easy to follow along with, and the dialogue was a tad easier to read than it was in the first installment. If you guys remember, you were definitely thou-theed into the high heavens in that one, and don't get me wrong, that's still present here, but in my opinion was felt a bit less, which was appreciated. Also, there's actually some pretty funny dialogue at times in Dragon Warrior 2, and some nihilistic comments early on to give it some edge. The two things that really jump out here in Dragon Warrior 2 are the world scale and the addition of multiple characters to your party. Huge leaps and advancements over Dragon Warrior. The world of Dragon Warrior 2 is huge. so big that you even make a return to Alefgard in this one. There's lots to explore, fight, places to get lost, and many people to talk to. Now touching back on the party members, Dragon Warrior is a solo affair, and having a nice mix of party members helps spruce up the game in a big way when it comes to battling, which apparently was one of the main goals of the devs going into the making of this game. Your party will consist of the main character, who is a traditional tank, the Prince of Canik, who is kinda like a bargain bin spell sword, and Princess Moonbrook, who's primarily known for her magic. The act of gathering said party is also pretty cool, adds to the journey, and doesn't take too long for you to get your party rolling. I'd also be remiss if I did not mention that Prince of Canik and Princess Moonbrook actually have randomized names when they join. I noticed that over the course of both my playthroughs that they were named different. A neat little addition. Aside from the party structure, the battling is fairly similar to that of Dragon Warrior. The main difference here is the parry mechanic. Basically, this allows a character to brace for a hit during a turn and sustain less damage. This could be useful in situations such as, let's say, Princess Moonbrook not dealing any damage to an enemy, but also not wanting to cast a healing spell, so the other two will swang and bang, and she could just chill out for a turn. Running is still a very viable and necessary strategy in Dragon Warrior 2, and also in the forefront are a variety of items that could be used in battle infinitely without breaking, yielding great results such as an entire party attack spell, or heal. Thinking of items here specifically like the Shield of Strength or the Staff of Thunder. And speaking of entire party attacking spells, enemies are now often put into groups, whereas in the original Dragon Warrior was always a 1 vs 1 affair. Because the enemies are split up into groups, make sure to check the numbers below to see the groups and analyze appropriately. Anyways, these group/entire party attack spells, they really help move things along in Dragon Warrior 2. Two spells that immediately come to mind are Firebane and Explode It. Or is it Explode? Is it French? Who knows? The changes brought forth to the battling system were very welcomed. It helped keep the battles a little bit more interesting, and the devs accomplished that goal. The dungeon variety in Dragon Warrior 2 is also improved, even if only slightly. There are some decent gimmicks in said dungeons to help keep things fresh, even if at times it could be quite annoying like this one in the lighthouse, or during my recent playthrough I had to slog through with Princess Moonbrook KO'd. The difficulty of Dragon Warrior 2 is, well, difficult. It's a rewarding experience throughout, and when it's completed. This is definitely not a hand-holding, auto-battle type RPG, especially later on. Also, very quickly, a couple more changes that differ from the first entry include more places to save, and a lottery ticket system, which basically you use a lottery ticket, spin a wheel, and hope for the best. Some interesting prizes can be won, but truth be told, I beat the game twice without really ever caring about this. I'd say it's more for a completionist or someone unwilling to do the Staff of Thunder glitch, which if you want to check that out, check out the short in the pinned comment or description below. All in all, Dragon Warrior 2 features some good gameplay improvements and changes. It's fun and challenging. Critiques. As great as Dragon Warrior 2 can be, it's not perfect. And here's where I'll highlight, or lowlight, the things that bothered me. First, I'll start off lightly with some things that I felt were middling or only mildly annoying. When you put in an attack and a creature dies, you then attack a vacant space similar to that of, let's say, Final Fantasy on the NES. I've never been a big fan of that. I much prefer the auto-targeting after the original target dies. I just feel like it adds a layer of artificial difficulty, probably masking a coding limitation. This becomes less of a problem later on in the game, but that's besides the point. As mentioned earlier, Dragon Warrior 2 is huge. As such, it can be very open-ended and confusing at times, more so than the original Dragon Warrior. There's lots of hints around the world. Sometimes though you'll find hints about things that you could have found way earlier in the game, in endgame areas. And without the appropriate paperwork that I have and was available back in the 90s, or the internet, you could find yourself getting lost or missing things. And though I enjoy the fact that you have 3 party members that are very different, and as such have a variety in the armor, weapons, shields, and spells, I kinda wish there was more in terms of variety and options. It's absolutely a step up from the first game, but it's a bit limited. Would have been nice for some more, quote, build variety. Now, before getting into my ultimate critique, I wanted to list off a few things that also bothered me. As mentioned previously, the battle screens are just black. They're not nice and detailed like the overworld battles on the first Dragon Warrior, and it kinda bothered me. The game is also still a very much old school entry in that if you use an item or spell, even if said character can't be healed more, for example, the game will still input it and you'll easily waste resources. Saving or reviving could also be a bit troublesome as not every town has both of these. Some towns only have one of the two, for example. Also, this is very minor, but it bothered me. The Step Guard spell, which allows you to walk on, to put it bluntly, hurting tiles. I wish that it ran on a time frame like the Repel Enemy spell. Instead, if you transition to a new area with more hurt tiles in the next one, you have to cast it again. This is pretty prevalent later in the game, not incredibly egregious, but still annoying. So yeah, most of my critiques so far have been very minor, but I saved the worst for last. The endgame of Dragon Warrior 2 is awful. I don't mean the sprites, I don't mean the landscapes, the design of the dungeons, or even the final boss really. Everything else though? Awful. You can realistically get through 90% of Dragon Warrior 2 organically, and with minimal grinding. Then when you reach the Cave of Roan and beyond, the game ramps up its difficulty to 11, and you best count your lucky stars for good run away from battle RNG, and then prepare yourself for thy great grind outside of Hargon's castle in Roan. You will spend lots of time here grinding, healing, dying, resetting, and repeating until you reach a level likely way higher than what you were after going through the Cave to Roan, because, well, casually, you need it. I think I saw that speedrunners beat the game with the main character at level 21, but honestly, I don't recommend that. I recommend getting something closer to 30, and then praying a little bit to RNGesus. While I do enjoy the final boss, it can be very annoying as it constantly has the ability to heal itself. Speaking of awful RNG, many of the endgame enemies have the defeat spell which can instantly kill a party member, and even worse, the sacrifice spell which kills the enemy that casts it, but wipes out your entire party in one fell swoop. I mean, really, did they really have to include this for the enemies? Honestly, the endgame is such a shame overall because I feel like the game was really good, paced out pretty well, and then it just hits a wall. Did they actually playtest these areas? Were they expecting everyone to overgrind prior to Roan and be close to level 30 already? I don't really know, but I do know this. The endgame pacing sucks. The game comes to a crawl. It literally turns into a grind and then run from every single battle possible except the boss gauntlet in Hargon's castle, which after defeating them, you then retreat, heal, save, go back again, hopefully run from everything, and then finally hopefully vanquishing the final boss, which as I said before, depending on RNG could be really annoying. Just, super big bummer. Thankfully, since I'd already beaten the game before, I knew this was coming and I prepared myself a little bit more mentally. But the first time that I played, whew, it was an eye-opener. In summation, Dragon Warrior 2 in many ways accomplished what it set out to do and be. It's a sequel. It enhances an already established formula, adds in some new tweaks and twists to keep things fresh and challenging, and it unveiled a new wide world of exploration with a deeper party. It has good graphics, a solid soundtrack, a decent story, and it's fun. However, the pacing issues of the endgame and the endgame itself really hold this game back from being a truly epic, legendary RPG in my eyes. If some tweaks were done, possibly enemies giving a little bit more experience and gold, so that your level is higher when you get to the Cave to Roan, stripping enemies of dumb spells like Sacrifice, honing down spells like Defeat, encouraging fighting at the end all because of this, instead of simply just running from everything, and maybe adding a little bit more variety for the builds of the characters, I think that this would have been a solid 9 out of 10. Now yes, I realize there are a bunch of remakes that address some issues, but I'm speaking solely on the NES version here. As such, I give Dragon Warrior 2 on the NES a 7.75 out of 10. I do think that this game is better than Dragon Warrior, hence why I gave it a higher score than my 7 out of 10 that I gave Dragon Warrior last year. Objectively, it's a better game and an improvement, though if I did have to choose between the two for a replay, I would probably still go with the first despite it being more limited in many ways. As I mentioned in my Dragon Warrior review, it's very replayable and charming. Dragon Warrior 2's endgame kinda deters me from replaying this anytime in the near future, but I wouldn't mind giving the Game Boy Color and Super Famicom remakes a spin at some point. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you want to check out more Dragon Warrior 2 content, check out the pinned comment and screen or description below. Take care.